The reality is that historically, every ceasefire got stuck in the first phase.
President of the Board of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. He's a former senior analyst and writer, Tareq Baconi.
Why did you write this book?
When you're living in a world where you don't have the words to describe sexuality and queerness, then you're living in the silence.
Two boys in Amman, a love hidden in letters, whispered in secret, a childhood marked by shame, silence, and longing, a man shaped by exile, by love, and by a mother's unyielding fire.
In a moment of genocide, all of our work and effort should be focused on keeping the gaze on Gaza. It's madness that the world is continuing, and these two temporalities are coexisting.
The world burns, Gaza bleeds, the region falls apart, and your own story refuses to stay quiet.
If Hamas disappeared tomorrow, the Israelis will always have an excuse that justifies Palestinian death. That's what Zionism is.
Do you think the genocide in Gaza, that influenced Mamdani's ability to become mayor of New York?
100%. This is a product of the genocide.
Welcome back to Out Loud, where we talk to people who challenge the status quo, many even by simply telling the truth about their lives. Today, I'm sitting with someone who I've admired for a long time, not just for his political mind, which is razor sharp, but for the emotional depth and vulnerability that he brings to his work. Tareq Baconi is the grandson of refugees from Jerusalem and Haifa. He grew up between Amman and Beirut and is widely known for his first book, Hamas Contained, which shifted how people talk about Gaza, how people talk about resistance, and of course, the fantasy of pacification. His new book, Fire in Every Direction, hits different. It's so tender, so unguarded, and brave in the most devastatingly powerful ways. It's a book about queerness, about Palestine, about shame, about desire, about survival, and the grace of finding beauty in the places that we're taught to hide from. Tareq, welcome to Out Loud.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.
I have so many questions, but I want to start with sort of the most basic. Why did you write this book?
So, in some ways, I always knew that I was going to write this book. So the book at its core for me is a story between two boys growing up in Amman. It's a friendship. It's a relationship that develops between the two boys. And it's a story of one of the boys falling in love with the other. So myself and this young boy called Ramzi, who is no longer a boy. He's a man existing somewhere in the world. And even as that experience and that relationship was unfolding and was growing, I knew that this was something that I wanted to come back to for two reasons. First, I knew that it was going to change my life and that it was sort of shaping my life and shaping who I was becoming. But maybe more importantly, because at the time I didn't know how to talk about it. And I didn't quite have the language to articulate what was happening or what I was thinking or what I was going through. And so, even as the relationship grew and then ended and life went on and I sort of went in many different directions, I knew that this was something that once I knew how to talk about it, or once I had the language to articulate what had happened, that this was a story that I would want to come back to and reclaim.
You said reclaim at the end there. And I have to tell you, while I was reading the book, there were times I had to put the book away, which is strange. I have this habit when I watch something that really engages me in all of my sort of senses, my mind, my heart. It can be overwhelming. I was so invested emotionally in your journey that I kept putting it away, hiding the book from myself, partially because I didn't want it to end, if I'm honest, but also because it was a lot for me to process. I'm curious, as you're promoting this book, this story, your story that you've been carrying most of your life, does it feel like your life finally caught up with your voice, or the other way around? You've said that writing this book was like writing your way into being. I'm curious what that means.
That's a beautiful question. Thank you. Listen, I just want to say before I answer that, you're not the first person to tell me this. I've had a number of queer or gay, however one identifies, men reading this book and telling me, actually, it's too much. I have to stop and take space from it. And that's in some ways really heartwarming, in other ways a bit...
I'm curious, your initial reaction when you hear that is worry and concern, or...
Yes. Yeah, well, not concerned, but I think I get overwhelmed by the sense that this that this is a universal experience. And so much of this book is about loneliness, actually, about me being unable to articulate something. And so when I hear that when I do articulate and when my words find space for someone else to connect so deeply with, I find it very moving in an overwhelming way, in a good overwhelming way. I'm sort of
Okay, so we're both overwhelmed in a good way. That's
Great,
like
great.
a reciprocal.
Great.
That's good. That's good.
That's a great start. So has my past sort of caught up with yes, I mean, I think in some ways this book is a work of integration for me. I think in many ways my writing on Palestine and my writing on Hamas specifically, and all of the kind of analytical work or the intellectual work that I do is a big part of who I am. It's how, in many ways, I found my way back to Palestine. But it always felt like there was some kind of partition or some kind of separation between that work and the kind of the emotional depth that I sat in, not just around queerness, but also around Palestine. And this book feels like the first piece of writing that I've done that integrates all of these aspects of myself in a way that's unapologetic. I'm not apologizing about queerness to Palestinians. I'm not apologizing about Palestinians to Westerners or non-queer people. So I feel like it's an act of integration. So yeah, I mean, I feel like this is the first time that I've been able to really be whole in my writing.
Did you know you'd share this story publicly? Did you always kind of think maybe these parts of your life would remain private, or did you know that this was eventually going to happen, this telling?
Listen, in writing this book, this is where denialism is so powerful. I tricked myself. I really believed deeply that this book wasn't going to be published. I keep saying, and people don't quite believe me, but it's not that I really believed that I was writing this book as a private act of liberation. And I had all these tricks to convince myself that it wouldn't get published. The writing isn't good enough. No agent will take this. Even if an agent takes it, no publisher will take it. So I sort of put all of these obstacles in place to convince myself that there was no way this book would be public and would be shared. And I have to say, in some ways, I needed that because I go into places in this book that I not even don't share publicly, but I don't necessarily talk about even in private settings. It does feel very private and very intimate. And I needed to put myself on the page fully in order for me to feel like that act of emancipation or that act of telling my story was real. And so, yes, I mean, I needed to trick myself into thinking that this wasn't going to be shared. And also, I'm a deeply private person, and this is very hard for me to sort of put myself in that space. And so I really feel like the writing of this book was also separate from the publishing. The writing was a deeply intimate personal act. And now I'm starting to sort of, the reality of what I've done is starting to catch up with me. And so the publishing process is, it's its own beast.
For what it's worth, I'll take this opportunity to tell you that I'm proud of you for doing that, given that you are a private person, because as someone who's probably less of a private person than you generally, I've definitely struggled with a very similar journey. I am proud of you, and it inspired me to be more proud of myself.
As it should be.
Yeah. Did you consider writing this ever as a pseudonym?
I knew it wouldn't be an option. I mean, I considered two things. One, I considered a pseudonym, and two, I considered fictionalizing. But for me, the power of this was the fact, I mean, so listen, the impetus for writing is that I wanted to tell Ramsey everything that I couldn't tell him when I was younger. And so there was no point in tricking myself into fictionalizing or adopting a pseudonym. The power of the writing is in saying, this is what the story is, and this is who I am, and this is what I want to be doing. And this is what I want to be saying. So I think a big part of it, I mean, the text is important, but more than the text, it's the public adoption of the text is core. I think that's a central element of this.
For people who don't know you, I mean, your book, Hamas Contained, serves a real academic and sort of, I mean, it's analytical. It's, you have so many skills as a creative writer, as an analytical writer. And I guess you've also written a short film. And I guess the prologue, like the opening, the beginning of the book, it's so cinematic. I mean, to me at least, like you open a box and you find Ramzi's letters, you know, the first boy you ever loved. And I guess I wrote this down. You know, we go from you opening the box, you know, and then we go through this journey of Palestine to Lebanon to Jordan, and your awakening, your queer awakening, the shame, the silence, the things you inherited, as you describe it, the exile of the authentic self, and also what I alluded to at the beginning, the impossible but beautiful work of learning to belong, right? And learning to belong to yourself. And I don't want to like put words in your mouth or get the chronology wrong, but what was the emotional impact for you of sort of going back through these letters, letting them be a guide for the reader, after so much time has passed? And I know you don't speak to Ramzi anymore.
Yeah, so I mean, just to maybe contextualize some of this. So the way that our relationship, Ramzi and I, unfolded was, so he was my neighbor, he was my classmate. A lot of it happened in the relationship and in the friendship as it developed, as it might between any two friends in teenage years. But there was another layer to it, which is that a lot of our relationship developed through letters. And we would write letters to each other every few days. And these letters became a place for us to maybe explore what we couldn't quite articulate in person, or maybe even, you know, you started this discussion sort of talking about hiding and putting the book away. And in some ways, the letters were that we would sort of write this thing that was animating us, and we would just deposit it with the other person, you know, as if it's too frightful to sort of talk about it. And so the letters stayed with me. And this is how I knew that I would always write this. Everywhere I traveled, the letters were stacked in a yellow box that traveled with me. And what is incredible about the process of going back to them is that I don't have my letters. I don't know what I wrote to this boy. I don't know how I articulated myself. I don't know what I confessed. But I only have his reactions, right? And so against his reactions, I construct myself. And as you say, it's a deeply emotional process, because sometimes I would look at his letters and think to myself, what was I doing? Like, why was I so ashamed, and why was I so weird, and why couldn't I just say the things that I wanted to say? It's almost like this mirror to the self that you're sort of trying to find yourself through the words of another person, and it's an unvarnished self, because it's not, you know, I can't recall what I was thinking or what I so yes, I think that was destabilizing, and also the passage of time. So as you say, I haven't spoken to Ramzi since the last letter I sent to him, and that's more than 20 years ago now. So I'm not the same person. I've evolved in every way. And so going back, I was trying to sort of put myself, not as I am today, but in the shoes of the boy who would have written those letters to Ramzi, you know, a 14-year-old boy in Amman pre-internet, and trying to imagine what that boy would have said or how they would have felt was humbling in some ways, also of how far I've come in my own self and in my own body.
It's fascinating to me, because the next question, you know, in the same way that you can't remember or access what you said to him, I wonder, and throughout the book, I wondered if you could speak to Ramzi today, or to the boy that he was when you were in love with him, what might you say? Or maybe that doesn't interest you. Is there something?
I was obsessed with this question at some point. I was obsessed with the question of, you know, if this whole thing is about language and is about me finally being able to say what I want to say, what would I actually say? If this, and right, and this, this is not a spoiler alert, but towards the end of the book, there's an imagined conversation, and readers will know from the very beginning that Ramzi and I haven't been in touch since then. So it's not spoiling anything, but I imagine an encounter towards the end because I'm obsessed with this idea, and this is where I realize that actually. Ramzi as a person today, the real Ramzi, whoever they are, and that's not their real name, obviously, but whoever they are, I actually don't care that much about them. I mean, I don't know them. I don't know anything about them. And I realize that actually they become more important to me as an imaginary presence. So they become this, you know, ideal man, you know, this beautiful, handsome man who has a great job, straight with kids, you know, everything that I I grew up sort of being told that this is what you need to aspire to.
Yeah,
And
what a
it's
man.
again,
Yeah.
right. And it's against this sort of unattainable vision of masculinity that I then construct my queer self. And so it becomes this, in some ways, a rhetorical device. It's like an imaginary. What is this thing that I can't achieve? And who am I in relation to that? And so I realized that actually in some ways, if it's like grinder dating, when you sort of project this incredible thing on this person and then you meet and then the projection
Always a
filters
letdown. I know.
right. And the projection is better. It's more important than the real thing. And I think this is what Ramsey as a rhetorical device is for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. That resonates. So I'm sure for other young queer people, particularly in the Arab world, who hear about this book in anticipation of reading it, I can imagine a lot of them would be wondering, well, what happened when he finally came out to his mother, his parents? That sometimes can be almost a myopic, like a very narrow concern when you're living in a dissonance. It always comes up when I meet people and they always bring up this thing sort of obsessively. So I must, for their sake, ask you the obvious question. I mean, I don't want to spoil the book either. So if I do, we can cut it out and don't worry. But after your mother finds the letters, or after everything sort of falls apart more or less. I mean, or at least let's say there was a big rupture. Did that inform sort of how you understand love and secrecy and danger?
It did. And in some ways, that rupture that you talk about, so there's a rupture that happens with Ramsey, and then that sort of ripples out and has a broader rupture that shapes my life then. But in some ways, the reverberations of that have informed my life to this day. They've informed how I think about, as you say, secrecy, but also how I think of intimacy, and how I think about what it means to not hide and to sort of bring the whole of oneself. So it's informed my romantic relationships, obviously. And in some ways, this book is me trying to teach myself a different lesson. So if telling Ramsey and then telling my family had created this rupture, and the lesson of that was don't tell, hide, and pull back, I'm sort of doing the exact opposite here. And I'm telling not just one person, I'm telling everyone. And come what may. And, I've said before, this could be the stupidest thing or the bravest thing I've ever done. But for me, it's an act of sort of teaching myself that, what is the worst that can happen? If I am grounded in the self, and if this is my narrative and I own it, then I'm indestructible in a way, on a personal level, because I know that this is
between you and yourself.
Between me and myself, this is who I am, and I own that fully, right? And so I think there's something here about repeating this act of confession through writing that had resulted in such shame and rupture in my childhood that now I want to live in as an act of reclamation and liberation. And so I'm trying to teach myself a different way of sitting with truth, I guess.
So interesting, because, the confidence and the conviction that you're alluding to and the clarity is so clear to me and so well communicated and apparent, even in your sort of navigating or guiding us through sort of your ups and downs over the years. This is all happening in a context that is Jordan, that is the Arab world. Your parents, Palestinians who then moved to Lebanon, got naturalized, became citizens, then, so much political violence and loss and survival over the years. I don't want to fall into any tropes, but I do want to ask you, at a time, and timing is really interesting. You and I have talked about this, I think, when we met in Doha, what it was like to navigate the genocide while working and publishing this book.
I mean, you say unsettling. I think that's an understatement for me. I've said this before, and I think I'll keep repeating it, in the sense that I think that publishing this book is obscene now. And in the same way that anything normal that we do now is obscene. I think in a moment of genocide, I think everything all of our work and effort should be focused on keeping the gaze on Gaza. And so, going out to meet friends, having coffee, going to dinner, teaching, anything that informs daily life is obscene when you know there's mass extermination that's happening and that you know about this mass extermination. It's this call to end this violence that you can't. And so you go into your daily life. And I think that it's that disconnect or disassociation that's so deeply unsettling. So, so I started writing this book in 2017. I finished this book before the genocide started. I would have never imagined it coming out in this moment. And I resisted in many ways because I felt that actually it's almost like I wanted life to stop. Life has to stop until this genocide ends, and then we'll figure out what it means. And I think we've been changed as humans witnessing this. And so how do we continue to live a normal life? And I don't know that I've resolved this, if I'm honest. What I do know is that I feel like I'm living in a dual temporality. I'm living on this sort of time horizon where, I'm living in London. I go to the US. I'm doing advocacy and political organizing. I'm writing. I'm publishing this book. I'm politicizing every single encounter I'm in to bring attention back to Gaza. And I'm sitting with my head and my body and my heart in Gaza thinking, how has this not stopped? It's more than 2 years, this horrific, sadistic violence, and it's madness that the world is continuing. And these two temporalities are coexisting. And honestly, I think in some ways, I understand intellectually that this book, as you say, it informs the story of my grandparents' expulsion from Haifa and Jerusalem and my parents from Lebanon. And so it's the story of the Nakba, and they understand intellectually the genocide as a continuation of the Nakba. So this book is that. But emotionally, there's been a rupture. Emotionally, I think I've been changed as a person in the past 2 years in ways that I still don't comprehend.
I couldn't help but think of I moved to Tunis a month before the genocide began with an intention to sort of explore new creative ways of being, of working, of sharing stories, of telling stories that includes music and art and film. I really was at a point where I had had enough of the nonfiction analytical thing. And, I heard you in an interview reference the writing of your first book, which was incredible and so well received and celebrated. And that style of writing, of analytical writing, you referenced it, I think it might have been on Democracy Now! As sort of like hiding, like in a way, and that you always knew that you would write another book, whether the memoir or something more kind of less analytical. And, it's easy to hide behind political analysis or geopolitics. And I can totally relate to that. So again, I think it's no surprise why we have similar experiences in this way. But what I was referring to with regards to Tunis is I often say, what a blessing it was to be there. So I didn't necessarily have to navigate the Western world where I think some of those things you were describing are more pronounced. That said, of course, I can totally relate to not fully comprehending how to exist in this moment, which makes it all the more awe-inspiring to me. Not only that you wrote this book, but that despite your resisting, and I think it's interesting that word resisting, that you're doing this in this moment, because to me, it's like everything is serendipitous. And the more when I finished the book, it affirmed what I had assumed at the beginning for you. For me, I wouldn't have assumed this, but I was like, wow, it's just this book does so much for individuals who can relate to a lot of your lived experiences. I can't imagine what it's like to be experiencing and witnessing and enduring the genocide and the madness, as you alluded to, and then also have something so personal be so shared so widely. And it goes without saying, but I'm sure you've anticipated on some level, consciously or not, how strangers will react. And maybe you don't care. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but has there been any reservation beyond, it's not the right time to distract attention away from Gaza? Because to your point, this is a story about Gaza, about the Nakba, about Palestine, about liberation, about freedom. And it just happens to be your story. And it's a story that like Palestine 36, the film I had the privilege of being a small part, playing a small role in, like even just that, the revolt before 1948 is something we often don't want to confront as Palestinians. How is it being received? And did you have concerns about how it would be received?
Yes, of course. I mean, I would be lying if I said I didn't. I had so there are many obviously constituencies in my head. I have to say that the only constituency that I care about at this stage is how Palestinians would read this book for the timing of it, not for the focus on the queerness. So I have long sort of shed this fear that, oh, you can't really bring questions of queerness into the struggle. We need to focus on, I've made peace with that a long time ago. And I really understand the struggle as obviously as an intersectional one. And so so that's not a thing for me, but the thing that is for me is if Palestinians saying, is this the time to talk about this? So that's sort of the constituency in my head that I'm most troubled by, because it mirrors and articulates my own discomfort with publishing this at a moment of genocide for all of the things that we just talked about. But in terms of how it's being received, I think the thing that I'm also obviously just as a writer holding and navigating is how is it received on a literary level? Is this book well written? Will it be seen as one that is touching people that readers can act? So obviously I have that fear that this was it took me 8 years. I put a lot of myself in it, and I'm trying to, as every writer is, sort of develop their craft. And so I'm curious about the reception on the literary level. And just in terms of how it's been received so far, I think it's too early to tell. The book's been out about a week. So it's really early. But it's already given me so much more than I could have hoped for. Just in terms of some of the conversations that I've been having, including this one, just the people that I've been meeting, I've been doing sort of back-to-back events the past 2 weeks, and every event just brings me so much joy and love from people. So in that way, I feel like it is really finding its way to readers and connecting with readers. But I don't know. I don't know what reception is beyond that.
I mean, I'm biased, and I'm not a literary critic by any means. But for me, if I had to sum it up, the book not only connected me to you and to your story and to Palestine, but it connected me to myself relentlessly. And that's always a joy. I'm pretty confident that that's over time going to compound. And I really believe that. And that's why I'm so happy to have you on and to be having this conversation. Really, I mean that. Let's bring it back to mothers. So your mother, like mine, studied in Lebanon with that explosive mix of, what can we call it? Rage, love, protectiveness, contradiction, but love that Palestinian mothers carry. And I'm wondering, what did you learn in the process of writing this about her or about yourself?
Yeah, listen, I did not, as I said at the beginning, I thought this was a story about two boys. I did not anticipate that I would write so much about my mother or about my grandmother. I didn't realize that in many ways I was writing a feminist book, how the struggle was passed on, the maternal, passed down along the maternal line.
Even the title. The title is from an allusion to feminine. I mean, for me, at least, that's how I understood it.
Well, also the phrase is taken from a way I'm describing my mother, that her rage is sort of this fire that's burning in every direction. So to give context, so grandparents get expelled from Palestine, and they for a brief moment in time, the Lebanese authorities are naturalizing Christian refugees, not Muslim refugees. So my grandparents naturalized as Lebanese citizens. My parents are born and raised as Lebanese citizens, and my mom is very active on Palestine throughout her sort of university years. And a series of horrifying things happened that culminate in Tel el-Zatar, the massacre in 1976, and her flight to Amman. She lands in Amman, this young, rebellious, political woman, activist, and is immediately domesticated. I think if your listeners, I'm sure, can you imagine the difference between Amman and Beirut? And so she immediately lands in this space that is stifling and confining and domesticating. And so that the sort of the largeness of her life gets subsumed into this space. And I think it manifests in my childhood in a lot of rage. There's anger in the house. And I think one of the gifts that this book has given me is that I always thought that, I couldn't quite understand as a boy what this rage was. I couldn't quite understand where it came from. As a queer boy who was carrying a lot of shame, I always felt it was my fault that somehow this rage was manifesting. And so I used to think that it was something that I made peace with and eventually forgave and eventually came to love. This is just who she is. And I think what this book has given me is to understand that actually it's not about forgiveness, it's about gratitude. I'm so grateful that she gave me this rage because now looking back, how the fuck would she not be this angry? Like she's taught me that you have to be angry at these things, these injustices, these systems of oppression. And in some ways, I now identify my own rage as something that she's passed on to me, my own rage at similar injustices, obviously Palestine, but also the patriarchy and homophobia. And so all of that rage that I carry within me, I really think that it's one that her rage, that her rage sort of paved the way for, that it sort of was passed down to me in that way. And so now I sit with this deep gratitude for how she's been able to generationally pass the struggle on.
I mean, it's wild how much I can relate to what you're describing now and also while reading the book. But there's a line at the beginning, it stayed with me long after I finished the book, where you refer to the look and Mama and Leith gave you. I think I wrote it down, was one I would become you wrote, the look Mama and Leith gave me was one I would become intimately familiar with, not unsettling enough to upset me, yet not innocuous enough to forget. When I read that line, and I think it's like your mom had you convinced her to buy you a doll, she bought you the doll, you're sitting next to the doll. And it's like, when I read that part, that's the first time I put the book away. I know, but I kept reading. Like, I put it away, like, next to me. And then, like, honestly, it's like I could do, like, a comedy sketch about, like, it's like when you want to read something so bad, why include that? And what was your intention? And do you remember what you felt in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a very important concept in the book. I sort of talk about these looks as darting shadows because I was trying to get at this sense that a lot can get communicated without any words being said. And when you're living in a world like Amman in the 80s and the 90s, where you don't have the words to describe sexuality and queerness, or the words were there, obviously, but they were not accessible to me for various reasons that we can talk about, then you're living in the silences. You're living in this space where nothing gets spoken, but everything is being said. And in Amman, there's this sense that, Aib, that only if things get noticed and talked about do they become problematic. What's happening behind closed doors is you can do whatever the fuck you want. It's
and
just
Amman is like a poster child of that in my humble experience of many Arab cities. Like it really takes the cream.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so
by the way, sorry, I'm kind of annoyed that you brought up the word Aib, only because my next question was, I'm going to say a word and I want you to tell me quickly what comes to your mind. And the word was going to be Aib. So I'm just going to do it now. What comes to mind when I say Aib?
The judgment, this sense that, what you just did crossed the line, or that is something you shouldn't have done. And so until you're able to withstand that judgment becomes shame. It becomes self-flagellation. It becomes, I shouldn't have done this. What am I thinking? So it's sort of this practice of diminishing of the self in order to fit into these confines that are imposed on you.
And shame is not a very productive emotion compared to guilt, for example. I mean, it's all consuming even. And for our listeners who don't speak Arabic, Aib means sort of shame Aib means shame, or can be used in the context of forbidden or things that you shouldn't do. But I mean, the word comes up a lot in the book as I expected it to. And how did the process of writing the book help you confront maybe parts of yourself that you might have been protecting or avoiding? Because so much of it is about protecting. Being in the closet, some people don't realize in the Arab world, many people say it's like a way to protect themselves. Like they don't think of it. Foreigners tend not to understand that. Like, it's always like, well, come out of the closet. It's the only, and some people don't want to for obvious reasons, but also less obvious reasons.
Yes, but I think that's an important point, and I think it's not my intention to suggest that the only way of freedom and emancipation is public exposure. I think that, yeah, and I understand actually in some ways, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, there is queerness by default is almost existing in the margins. And so there is queerness in the silence. There is queerness in the being in the closet in some ways, if you're able to. And so I'm more interested in the self and in sort of the internal dynamics than how it relates to the public dynamics. And so I'm not trying to say that, all of this language around Taib is one that we need to completely upend and I do think that there's a lot of work to be done in how we think about Taib as something that's socially confining, not liberating. But I'm more interested in how that Taib translates into shame or not. So now, for example, if I get that look, or if I'm told what you did was just Taib, it doesn't land in the same way. I'm inured to that. I'm able to sit with that and still hold myself whole and take that Taib back to them. And sort of, it's your own insecurity, it's your own discomfort. So I'm really interested in that, in the internal process that gets you to the place where you can own your narrative, or what you refer to as authentic self. I refer to as authentic self in the book. How you're able to embody your authentic self internally to yourself, not to anyone else. And listen, if I want to be very generous, and this is really sort of pushing myself, there's also a way of thinking about Taib as something that's beautiful, in the sense that it's also creating this dynamic of what are the social norms that we allow each other to exist in, and where there's a certain sense of dignity and civility and politeness. And so Taib, I don't think is always negative. I think it gets weaponized against women or queer folk or minorities in ways that are destructive. And that's where I think silences need to be shattered, or at least certain conversations need to be had. But there's another way of engaging with Aib that is not judgment laden,
So speaking of Aib and Aib things to do, you decided to come out to your mother, I think after college and during college. I'm more curious about how the dynamic played out between your mother and father, if I may ask, in that scene where she prepared him in a culturally, contextually familiar way to me. Maybe for our listeners, like, you came out to her, and then before you came out to him, she helped you in a way.
Yes, she did.
You don't have to give it away. You don't want to give it away.
No, it's so just a rupture happens in my late teenage years, and I very quickly go back into the closet and decide that this is it. I'm just a straight man now. I need to figure out how to live this life. And it takes many years for me to come back to a place where I'm able to undo all of that and to begin the process of accepting myself and coming out. And so by the time I come back out to my mother, I'm doing it not as an act of I'm not asking for acceptance or trying to find an ally who might help me understand this. I'm coming out as a statement of fact. This is what it is, and this is what we're dealing with. And this is yours. Now it's your journey to have. And so it comes from a place of me having done the work internally and feeling like I wanted my family to be a part of this world that I was starting to inhabit. And to sort of say that if you choose not to be in this world, that's your choice. But I want you in it. As versus me saying, I'm not sure that I want you in this world because I want to keep this separate. I don't know how you'll deal with it. I sort of felt that they will get there and that they will sort of heed this invitation to come into my world. And so I come to her with that, I guess, with that sensibility and with that sense. And she's incredible and she's able to hold it. I think she's also probably at that stage been sitting with the fact that a certain rupture happened, and now, Ahmed style, we don't really talk about it, but we all know it happened. And so she sort of rises to the occasion to the point where, as you say, she she prepares my father to receive this information, and he does. And that begins a very difficult journey that ends more beautifully than I could have ever imagined or allowed myself to imagine. And I'm very aware that this is not a typical story, and that only sort of raises my gratitude and my love for them, because I'm able to understand that they were able to hold this.
It's beautiful, the way it plays out and the way you talk about it, because it seems so true to you and your experience. You write about your father searching for blame, sort of, if I may say, or that's how blaming kind of the time you spent in the West, outside influence. Why do you think blaming, someone is sort of a default initial reaction for so many families, especially in the Arab world, when confronted with queerness? What was your reaction when he said sort of, blaming it on that, or even when he said you can't stay in Jordan, which I think was his initial reaction? I mean, how did you react, and why do you think there needs to be blame? It's like, oh, the way you raised him, you were too soft on him. There's like an age-old adage, but yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
So there's definitely something about this sense of foreignness, that this doesn't belong here, and so there has to be an outside influence that has made this happen. So going back to the point about silences, of course this happens here, but it all happens privately, and it's unspoken and it's unseen. And so I think it's very easy for people to just feel like they can't relate to this, that this is something that's foreign. This is something outside of our ecosystem. And so it immediately becomes a game of blame. How did this happen? What went wrong? How do we trace this back to the source? And is the source foreign and Western? And in many ways, the work of people like Joseph Massad is in sort of desiring Arabs, in sort of thinking that the way that queerness exists in the region is, men who have sex with men, and not necessarily adopting these labels that are imposed on us, still getting married, still having children, still adopting to the norms of the norms, the sort of that underpin our society, without that limiting our sexuality. That there's a different way of being, and that actually the coming out is this sort of Western impulse. And in some ways, there's truth to a lot of that work, and it's important. And it's also important to recognize that, that there's a way also of queer communities wanting to not remain hidden, and wanting to not marry women, but to build lives with, if you're a gay man, with men. And so sort of, and for that to not only be a Western thing, that this is maybe a way for us to reclaim an indigenous and real way of being with our politics, with our societies, but that makes space for our sexual awakening. And I think that the fact that this conversation isn't happening is what then drives people to blame and sort of get them to think about a Western involvement.
I'm so glad you said that, because I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that, a lot of the laws used in the Arab world to criminalize queerness, as I'm sure you know, were imported through European sort of colonial legal codes, right? Whether it's Egypt, Sudan, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and I'm not saying that just to sort of okay, that's because people don't know that, the Ottomans decriminalized homosexuality in the late 19th century. This is a journey that is hard enough. And I don't know, I just want to make sure, are you aware? I mean, there are others who have written with such grace and detail and sort of about this subject in a personal way, but there aren't that many. And I imagine a lot of people are going to be very keen to read this book. Is there an audience you wrote this book for? And were there times while crafting it that you wanted to reach a certain community more than another?
There's a deep sense of reckoning with privilege and class in the book as well. And I'm deeply aware of the fact that privilege cuts in different ways. So grandparents expelled Palestine, parents expelled Lebanon. I flee Jordan, and I sit in this book with this idea of flight. Well, who I'm not forced out. I could stay in Jordan, and my flight is privileged. I leave to study, and then I end up staying in the West, and that gives me certain passport privileges. It gives me certain access privileges, and I can't put that in the same category of flight as someone fleeing war or violence. Um, but I'm very curious about that sense of flight or sense of self-exile, and I think it's a form of estrangement because this place that I come from doesn't allow me to be in ways that I want to be. And so there's a lot there that I grapple with in the book, and I sit with this idea of, if you think about the Arab revolutions, right, and the fact that many of them, at least temporarily, have failed. Many of the people who were core activists are now residing in the West. And that's not to say that the West is a place that welcomes them or that doesn't have problems, but there's a way in which, when you're fighting certain regimes of oppression, you have to move out and you have to move back in. So I think my story is it's only my story. It's a story of someone who was able to leave, and by leaving, developed or acquired access, enacted certain privilege, was able to come to terms with a narrative and with queerness, and even with the politics on Palestine, being able to go back to Palestine that might not be accessible to someone who had stayed. I'm very aware of that privilege. At the same time, I think that it's important to not position that as something that is foreign. It's a very Palestinian narrative as well, sort of thinking that Palestinians in the Shatat have a different experience. Of course they have a different experience. They're not in the Shatat by choice. They're in the Shatat because there's a colonial regime that has forced them to flee. And so I think that kind of breaking things into, that's Western, that's not it, does it a service to the fact that we're all in this space together fighting these regimes and trying to, from different positionalities, figure out how we can come at them.
And I'm wondering, I mean, we talked a little bit about how queerness is tolerated in Jordan, in the region, in Dubai, in Egypt, as long as it's silent. And whether it's explicitly penalized in Egypt, it's technically not illegal to be homosexual, and yet it's obviously de facto treated in a very, very aggressive, as a threat to national security. And it seems like everything's being polarized. Your short film, One Like Him, and now this memoir, both reclaim narrative and reclaim language. If we can shift gears a bit into a thought that is the political analyst, you've spent years analyzing the relationship between Hamas and Israel, or Hamas in itself. What do you make of this moment that we're living in, where the world seems to be not only normalizing genocide and calling it peace, but that a frighteningly, in my mind, majority of the political establishment and the media establishment are really just, covering their eyes and ears and avoiding the very overt violations and belligerent violations of the so-called ceasefire. What do you think is preventing us yet again from actually moving towards a real peace?
I mean, I would go one step further and say, not only are the media platforms sort of covering their eye, I actually think I've gotten, over the course of this genocide, I've become really, I really believe that they're actually ideologically committed to it. It's not that they're covering their eyes they're actually ideologically committed to erasing the Palestinian narrative and making sure that that doesn't threaten or challenge the Zionist narrative and therefore the Zionist worlds that they live in the sort of the so-called Western democracies. So I think that there's something that's ideological here. And I think that, thinking about narratives and stories and this sort of Palestinian permission to narrate that Edward Said spoke about, in some ways, I've been thinking a lot about how we now have the permission. We are narrating, we are, all of everything that we've seen from Gaza was narrated by Palestinian journalists in Gaza telling us what's happening. And so it's not that we don't have the permission to narrate necessarily, it's that no one wants to hear what we're saying. And I think that's really important to grapple with, because I think this question of storytelling and the narratives, who are we saying these narratives to, and what do we want to get out of that? And so I felt this very strongly, that we should never fall into that trap of storytelling to humanize, because that's we reject the frame that we have to prove our humanity. But I still think that storytelling for us and for our people is deeply important, because that's how we hold our agency and how we hold our politics and how we hold our truth. And so I think that when I'm sitting in this moment, and we can talk about everything, I'm telling the story in English, and all of these things, all of these layers that I've spoken about, and we can talk about. But I think that the reason that there isn't a change is because I think collectively, and certainly as the so-called Palestinian leadership, still have this idea that we can go as supplicants to the West or to international law and change things. And I think that might have, I've sort of obviously been a huge critic of this for many years, but I think post-genocide, it's existential, more vital than ever for us to think about. Actually, we have to think in terms of power, and we have to think in terms of moving away from these sort of Western powers and developing power either with allies or with global. And it's not the sort of the global South-Western divide, but more sort of thinking about the
Broad.
people. Yeah, but people globally who share the values of what the Free Palestine means, because it's a global thing, not a Palestinian thing, and to sort of think about power and think about shifting the balance of forces and moving away from these institutions that continue to erase our narrative. So creating new platforms and new ways to tell our stories and to turn that into power, I think.
It's so funny. It's not funny. I'm working on a project with certain people who I won't name because whatever, but the point is, it's about exactly that, like Palestine, not as a litmus test, but how it's come to mean so much more in this moment that we're living in the world, given the genocide, given how it's been broadcast. Speaking of power and shifting sentiment on Palestine in the West, while in the Arab world, there are, at least in the halls of power and amongst decision makers, an increasing consensus to sort of disarm Hamas. If Hamas disarmed tomorrow, or completely disappeared, right? All the fighters, even though it's an idea, as we both know, but let's just say Hamas, whatever, Hamas disappears. What would materially change for Palestinians in Gaza in terms to the day-to-day, in your opinion?
Not much. I think, as I've argued in my book, so the book came out in 2018, so this was years before the genocide. And I argue in the book that a conception in the world, in the global consciousness, is that the blockade is put in place because of Hamas, that they sort of want to have sort of a sense of security, the Israelis, obviously within their security framing, that Gaza is problematic because of Hamas. And I argue in the book that that's a red herring, that if Hamas were to disappear tomorrow, the blockade would still be there because the blockade predates Hamas. And because the blockade is about demographics, to how, this is quintessential apartheid. How do you put people of a certain demographic in small urban enclaves to create the illusion of a demographic majority elsewhere? So this is what Gaza is. And so it's really not about Hamas. And if you were to take Hamas out before the blockade, I think would have stayed in place. And it's an extreme situation of that argument now, but I really think that if Hamas disappeared tomorrow, the Israelis will always have an excuse that justifies Palestinian death, because that's what Zionism is. I mean, to justify itself, Zionism has to erase Palestinians. It's predicated on the idea of erasure. You have to create a land without a people. This is the core of Zionism. So if Hamas were to disappear tomorrow, Palestinian resistance will persist in different ways. It might not be a military body that's as organized or hierarchical or well-resourced as Hamas, but there will be resistance because there's apartheid. And there will always be the narrative of, because there's this resistance, we have to use this violence, and so I don't think anything fundamentally will change for the Palestinians.
Shifting gears, do you think the genocide in Gaza and how much of America and young people in America in particular have seen it and felt it viscerally and now understand it in a new way and can connect it to their own struggles and realities? Do you think that influenced Mamdani's ability to become mayor of New York?
100%. I think that I think Mamdani is an incredible politician because he's able to transcend identity politics and go into
And
economics.
speak to everyone in their language.
Well, yes, but also to speak about economics, to speak about the fact that, this is an issue about cost of living. Whoever you are, there's inequality and there's economic disenfranchisement, there's racialized capitalism. And so he's able to, in some ways, adopt the real leftist positions that transcend identity and talk about economics. But I don't think that Mamdani would have been able to mobilize to this level and have this victory if it wasn't for Palestine. And so I think I really look at Mamdani today and I think this is a product of the genocide. This is a product of the fact that more people are disillusioned with the hypocrisies of these institutions in the West, specifically in the US, and with how actually they are institutions that reenact violence and that reenact power and hegemony of a certain class of people. And so I think in some ways it's a revolutionary victory, and I think it comes through because of Palestine.
Do you think that, people say Palestine is the litmus test of our humanity, and it calls for us to work to eradicate and gain a deeper understanding of capitalist roots and colonial and imperial roots that are embedded in this international system that governs our lives, and the international law framework that supposedly also is governing our lives, which obviously is not. I mean, do you think that's an overstatement, that it's a litmus test?
I don't think it's an overstatement. I think very deeply that actually, if we want to think about, so there's a moral issue, which I think has always been there, but under genocide and the fact that it was live streamed has shown us beyond a doubt that this. But I'm not, when I think about Palestine specifically, Palestine generally and Gaza specifically as sort of this litmus test, I call it the epicenter. It's not just a moral issue. For me, it's a political issue. We cannot think of a global order that is egalitarian and that has actually dealt with the colonial baggage of the last century without a free Palestine. Everything. So if there's still a free Palestine, if there's still a colonized Palestine, it means colonialism is still alive and well. And so there's no way for us to transcend the era of empire and colonialism, even with the wave of decolonization of the last century, without a free Palestine. So there's no way for us to imagine what a reformed UN could look like or how the planet could deal with climate change without actually dealing with structures that enable colonialism to continue to exist. And that's Zionism, right? And so how do you dismantle that is a global question. It's not just a Palestinian question.
And I think when people like Francesca or others vocally out loud channel that or reference that or frame things as such, that's why, to answer your rhetorical question earlier, like, who are we narrating to? And they don't want to hear our stories. I mean, that's why they don't want to hear anything about Palestine. I mean, it's the same thing when I asked you about the media establishment. You were like, no, I think they're actually like committed to it ideologically. I wanted to ask you why, but I think we both know more or less the answer why is that, it's all speaks to the same system that they're benefiting.
They're all entangled in colonial. The New York Times today is a Zionist body. If there's a free Palestine, the New York Times would have to completely be a different organization. So there's a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And that exists in different institutions in different ways. I think Zionism is deeply enmeshed in sort of thinking about these structures of power here, because it's not just Zionism. Zionism and white supremacy and the patriarchy are different facets of a similar ideology.
All right, I appreciate the analyst hat. It's always enlightening talking to you about this stuff. I do want to shift gears towards maybe the future, towards joy. Throughout the memoir, I thought there were ways in which you found beauty in unexpected places, even in the abandonment and the shame in that longing. I'm curious where you find beauty these days or joy.
Honestly, in conversations like this gives me a lot. I think being able to be with community. In some ways, I say that the genocide has changed my life. I mean, obviously on an emotional and political level, but also materially. A lot of my life has. There are many communities that used to be a part of my life that aren't anymore. But in other ways, my community has deepened. My sense of relationships and commitments to comrades and allies has sort of just become much more expansive, and so I find a lot of joy in that, and even in the grief, and maybe because of the grief, there's joy. I think they're sort of mirror images of one another, and so I get a lot from community, from chosen family, from being able to sort of exist in these spaces.
And I think so many of us who shuttle around the world, for better or worse, even with the privileges that come with that, and for whatever the reasons are, I think so many of us feel at home when we're with our community, regardless of the physical location. I can relate to that more and more the older I get, and I think it's only been accelerated by the genocide. So I can totally relate to where you find joy, and I appreciate that answer so much. I had Susan Abul Hawa, who I think is one of the most clear-eyed people about what's happening today. Even if some people think that she's gone a bit too far in her rhetoric here or there or whatever, but the point being, she mentioned what you referenced earlier, which is anger, and how your mother's rage, and how, you saw that essentially as a gift and it made you feel gratitude. And she's always saying it's actually, they don't want you to be angry. They want you to think anger is bad or rage is bad. It's about channeling the rage. And so for those people who are new to this cause at a moment when it's carrying so much more meaning than perhaps just Palestine and Israel, what would you say to them to kind of help get some clarity into action? Or is there something you can leave us with that can instill some hope or a remedy to the rage and the heartbreak?
Listen, I don't think we need a remedy. I think rage and heartbreak are real and they're right. I think this is what we should be feeling. But I think they're not productive emotions, or they're on their own, they're not productive emotions. So if we are actually thinking about what a free Palestine means, I think that rage and heartbreak, just sitting in rage and heartbreak, is insufficient. We need to channel both into real change, and we need to channel both into power. I think as activists, we're often scared of power, and we need to think about what would it mean for us to take over institutions, and to sort of, if not take over institutions because they are irredeemable, to create new institutions that give us powers that are able to channel this rage and heartbreak into productivity. Ultimately, the way that I hold myself is that I am accountable to the people who are facing the brunt of the colonial regime. What they need me to do, I will do. If my role in London or in New York is to act in any way that creates more space for that struggle to proceed, whether rhetorically or materially, then that is what my duty is as someone who is in struggle with my fellow sort of brothers and sisters in Palestine. And so I think it's that. It's insufficient and quite offensive, frankly, to just sit and say we're angry and heartbroken. And we need to think about, okay, well, how do we act as agents to change this reality in the place that we're in today? Understanding your positionality. If you're in New York City, you're not part of the armed resistance. So, think about what your role is. And think about how, going out in New York City and sort of thinking about how you can create a new reality there is important, because you're challenging the heart of Zionism. And I think when I want to sort of think about moments of joy, or not joy, but moments of hope, as you say, I think Zionism has never been weaker. I think it's never been more scared. I think it's never been more frail and seen for what it is. And so I think that it's an existential battle for us. And I really think that if we think strategically and if we think thoughtfully, it's ours to win. I think it's just mobilizing in that way with that kind of political direction.
Wow, some guiding principles there to live by in such perilous times. I mean, I think that answered it well for me. Thought I could talk to you for ages, but I'm gonna let you go. And I hope you are, and I trust that you are writing about this. You keep coming back to sort of power and leveraging power and redefining power for ourselves, and I hope you're communicating that, or maybe writing a book about that or something, because I think it's something too many of us don't want to grapple with, or when we do, we deal with it abstractly. And not concretely and not tangibly. And as you said, it's ours to win. So with a little bit more power, I think it's like the pendulum can swing. So I appreciate you so much. And I want to thank you for your honesty, for your vulnerability, and for trusting the world with your story. Because I think had it remained hidden, many of us would be, not worse off as a result. And I think this book is a reminder for all of us that exile isn't about physical space. It can be emotional exile. I've dealt with that, sexual, generational. And for everyone listening, please find the book, buy the book, read the book slowly. You don't have to be like me and put it away and hide it from yourself. No, but really sit with it and let it move you the way it moved me. It got all the juices flowing in all the right ways. So thank you so much.
Habibi, Ahmed, I want to say I appreciate you too. And thank you for giving me the space and for all the work that you do.
Oh, no, the pleasure is mine, man. Really, really. Trust me. And for those of you listening, this has been Out Loud with Ahmed Eldon. Until next time, stay brave, stay loud, stay soft, stay all the things.